the election of Donald Trump that allowed for a new state of exception to emerge through the invention of the Russiagate story and the creation of a disinformation campaign around the Steele dossier, which, was not only used to delegitimate, to question the legitimacy of Trump, but also used as a way to question the legitimacy of any oppositional forces in politics that might start to emerge. They called Joe Stein a Russian agent. They called Bernie Sanders a Russian agent. They could label news stories that were inconvenient as Russian disinformation.
I mean, I think both of us at some point on Twitter, someone has accused us of being Russian assets.
Happens to me all the time, yeah.
It's funny. I've got Russian asset, government plant, federal agents, enemy of the people.
Who called you the enemy of the people other than me recently?
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. All right. So, Deep State Kuba, you are a co-host on This is Revolution. You are a consultant in your day job, right? For various NGOs and corporations, primarily who you do consulting for. Is that right? Or
primarily for the U.S. government and international organizations.
Okay. These days, what's the difference? You're always very helpful when it comes to understanding international affairs. I had you on several times to talk about the invasion of Ukraine. At the beginning, I turned up at your wedding. We are allies and friends, but we have to, I want to state at the beginning, I think you and I have a disagreement about what's possible politically today, perhaps.
I think maybe we should start with where we disagree, and at a very general level, talk a little bit about what free speech is for, what the idea behind it, what we want out of it. Because I think there's very little daylight between us. As a person who works with ideas and information, I want to be able to, and as someone who has political beliefs that fall a little outside the mainstream, I want to be able to express those ideas and beliefs without fear of sanction, at least privately, or in a non-professional capacity. And I also would like to have access to uncensored and accurate information about things that, say, the government or powerful corporations or other important actors are doing in the world, which they might otherwise want to conceal from me, as well as know when I'm being lied to, whether it's by a scam, an internet scam artist trying to push a crypto scheme, or whether it's a political actor working towards some agenda, even one that I may find generally acceptable. But, no one wants to be lied to. No one wants to be convinced of false information, of narratives that are inaccurate and potentially misleading. ones that people act on, propagating through different media channels, whether online or in broadcast media or in print.
I would just add that I want also to have the right to express opinions and ideas that are counter to the conventional wisdom, that might be extremely critical of the state as it exists now. I want to be able to organize politically, and part of that means communicating with people about things that they don't often encounter, or from a perspective that isn't, perceived opinion, or that might even be offensive to some, or troubling. I don't want to have those ideas curtailed based on accusations of being
Sure. And I don't think we disagree there either. And for instance, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, heroes, kings, absolutely. Chelsea Manning, absolutely. These are people who have paid a very dear price for these values, and to they're the victims of censorship, and which I consider to be a real travesty of justice. So I think that ultimately the world that we would like to inhabit is a very similar one.
Right. So I get trouble for this when I say this. So some of my own patrons are like, will call me a hypocrite when I make a claim like this, but I would put Matt Taibbi in the same terrain as
I was reading Matt Taibbi when he was publishing The Exile.
Right. Yeah. So, and at the moment, this is a journalist who has been threatened with perjury charges, speciously, and who, has had the IRS come to his house, seemingly as in a way to get some retribution for his,
I hate Matt Taibbi. There's no argument there.
So where's our disagreement then? Because we agree on the principle, right? And we agree even about how it's honorable to expose information that the state doesn't like when it's in the public interest.
True information in the public interest.
Right. True information in the public interest. But often enough, it's unclear when a whistleblower comes forward the degree to which the information they present is true. Like Edward Snowden is an example where there was an effort to discredit him in terms of his motivations, calling him a Russian agent, and to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the information that was presented based on.
Well, I think that the case of Edward Snowden and most of what WikiLeaks did is actually best practice in terms of these kinds of leaks. They worked with journalists and media organizations in order to, ones that they weren't personally connected to prior to the leaks, in order to authenticate that, redact the information when it was appropriate. And then it was placed in proper context and released to the public. I think that that's how one should do it. That's a
right. And not to belabor a point here, but despite whatever we might think about Elon Musk, that is how he proceeded to release the Twitter files. He worked with journalists who then were able to go through the documents and authenticate the information that came forward. They didn't publish everything, but sensitive material was kept out of the Twitter files, and but they did, and they authenticated the information that did come forward to put it into context.
And I have no beef with the Twitter files either. I don't think that this is information that shouldn't have been published. I think that there is a public interest in knowing what type of entanglement there is between the state, especially the security apparatus, Justice Department, political campaigns, and social media platforms, which in a lot of ways are kind of the printing press of our times.
Mm-hmm.
And so that information revealed, I don't see any reason to why it should be punished or stigmatized. It should be taken and evaluated by citizens and journalists and placed in the proper context of what it means for American politics.
So I watched
Mm-hmm.
the hearing on the weaponization of government that Taibbi and Schellenberger were, the primary witnesses there, and also read the Twitter files. I started kind of poking around. A lot of what is shocking to me is not being hidden, but in fact announced. So just as an example of the kinds of things that I find troubling, in Sweden last year, a new agency was formed called the Psychological Defense Agency.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an agency aimed at protecting the Swedish public from disinformation from the Russian government. And, I kind of assume that it's going to be operating along the same lines as CISA does in the United States. And if it does, that means that part of what it will be doing is trying to control what is said on social media and that Swedish people can read, and also probably the infiltration of news organizations in Sweden to give them directives around what will constitute disinformation in the months ahead, and to training on combating disinformation, which means setting the editorial agenda for news organizations, say television stations, based on the state's account of what the truth will be or is, and in the context of social media, limiting what can be said on those platforms, again, based on the interests of the security state, which is, aligned with, I would say, with U.S. interests, and that means, with the war effort or the escalation of the war in Ukraine and a variety of other topics and policies. So I find that to be a major infringement on free speech and the rights of the public to have an informed, to be informed so they can politically organize. And I find it to be really troubling that it's happening systematically, across the world, not just the United States, not just in Sweden, but in the EU and UK and as we already knew, in China and in Russia, and the control of the press and the control of the information the public can get is that's to be expected in authoritarian regimes, but to have that happen in so-called nominally democratic nations is troubling to me. So I wonder, would you see that institution, the Agency of Psychological Defense, or CISA in the United States, as less troubling than I do? Or is that where we might have a difference of opinion?
I think that the ism of treating this as a state versus citizens issue, that we've got one actor who are plucky people like us that want to have their say and they want to have access to information, and on the other hand, you have shadowy government organizations, agencies going around and in means covert and open, try to control what is said and what is permitted. I think that flattens an issue which is much more complex. And if you'll give me a moment, let me lay out my view of how the sort of free speech industrial complex operates. On one level, you have the legal regime, what is legally sanctioned, what is legally permitted, the sort of official position in terms of rights and obligations, powers of the state. In the case of the United States, the constitutional order of the First Amendment. In many Western democracies, there's similar codified popular rights. Canada, it's a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There's different terms for it. There's different legal structures, but often rights enshrined, the official legal position is the same, which can't be said of a state like Russia or Saudi Arabia or North Korea or China. There, the legal regime is quite different.
Mm-hmm.
Downstream of that, not determined of that, is the legal apparatus that protects those rights and enforces whatever limitations there are. In the United States, it's the legal system, ultimately the Supreme Court, the Department of Justice, and the civil courts on issues around things like libel or breach of NDAs, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just the agencies, but you also have to think about who's staffing them. How do they work? How do they function?
Mm-hmm.
That's one level. Another is what's the policy level? What is the government position on what is beneficial information, what disinformation, favored narratives, which may be true, favored narratives which are untrue, and that messaging that stems from the government in power, as well as, and then downstream from that, but not determined by that, the agencies and individuals that implement those policies. That's where, the security state comes in, especially when it comes to things that are euphemistically called information operations.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of the United States, then we could talk about the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Defense, these different branches of government that actually, the White House press secretary, both the office itself and the individual, right? People who are speaking for the government, whether officially or covertly, as well as the people who are trying to interfere with other people's speech for the sake of government. So we've got the legal regime, then we've got policy apparatus. And then you have to think about media ownership, the political economy of communications. You have different platforms. This will be partly technologically determined, but also partly determined by the structure of the economy. Who owns things like Twitter? Who owns broadcast agencies? Who owns television channels, TV networks? Rupert Murdoch being another significant actor in this case. Downstream of that, but not determined by that, are the journalists, executives, producers, other people who staff and actually operate, present information through those private channels or non-government channels, if you will.
Mm.
In many countries, there's public broadcasters, which can have a very ambiguous position. An agency, an organization like the BBC or the CBC, in a lot of ways operates like a non-government media network. But you also have ones which are direct propaganda arms of the state. And even in places where propaganda is the official function, the raison d'etre of a particular media platform, there are journalists working in it who operate according to their own ethics, according to their own logic, and to their own preferences. So you have law, policy, media, and then you have the And then downstream from that, the people who actually work and affect those structures. Only at that point do we get to the most disempowered segment, which are media consumers, citizens, the people who want to talk, want to express their opinions, and want to have access to information. The kind of informed citizen ideal of the Enlightenment that the Constitution was written for. Then, as always, you have the demographic and economic reality that underpins the public's ability, patterns and limits the public's ability to absorb and express information. And then the plethora and network of non-media platform actors in the, what we could call the speech space, right? Mm-hmm. NGOs, podcasters, citizens, people on Twitter, influencers, you name it. And if you want to get to that endpoint where you have access to true information, you're not just being drowned with bullshit or damn emails, or you're not being lied to all the time by everybody. But you can find some information, some from sources that you trust, and actually trust it. And then be able to have discussions and informed engagement information. You need everything to go right at every level, upstream and downstream. You need a rights-respecting legal regime and judicial agencies that enforce it in good faith. You need a government which has a policy of protecting free speech, protecting whistleblowers or not persecuting them, of abiding by the rules established through the constitutional order and enforced through the court system rather than disregarding them or ignoring them, that presents information and collects information, because there's all kinds of very relevant information which only the government can collect on our behalf, things like the census, things like information from NASA, from weather agencies, essential information for understanding the world, but ones which we can't, as regular citizens, go out and figure out ourselves. In a lot of ways, right, the FDA and regulatory agencies fall into this camp. I'm not going to go into a pharmacy and assay every pill that's available. And I'm not going to run trials for every kind of medicine that I may need and use. I require some kind of agency to do that. I can't trust pharmaceutical companies to do it for me. So this is a role for the government, and I need that information to be true and accurate. If it's not, then, you might end up dying some kind of side effect or complication, which bad enough when it happens in a situation where, no one could have known because it's an extremely rare condition. But if you think of things like the flipper babies that were, as a result, that were born because of, I think it was thalidomide, the antidepressant that was given to pregnant women in the post-war period. Well, that would be a case of that kind of government failure. And those agencies can't just be in place, but they need to be staffed by people who treat that mission seriously and who have integrity, conduct of their professional duties. And then you also need the ownership, political economy of media platforms to not be oppositional, cynical, manipulative. If For instance, like Rupert Murdoch is a great example of an individual who is not part of the government, completely unrelated to the operation of power, at least in any formal sense, but plays a baleful influence in pushing disinformation, right? Through very legally, everyone's complaining about Fox, but the government isn't doing anything about it. And downstream, you have the question of ethics in journalism, right? If you have journalists who are colluding with the state, or colluding with foreign interests, or colluding with criminal organizations, scammers and frauds, in order to use their position in the speech system to abuse people, to push lies that are constructive for them, then that also interferes with the free speech environment that we would like to create, that we would like to have. Finally, after all of that, you get to the people themselves. And the Constitution, as the 1619 Project loves to point out, was written by property holding, in many cases slave holding, white men for property holding, in many cases slave holding white men. It was an exclusionary document, and those rights were never considered to be a universal possession that, women or Black people or the poor's should be able to use. The Enlightenment, where this very concept of freedom of expression being a foundational element of an enlightened society, of a progressive society, of good governance, that it comes out of the Enlightenment, that movement was ambivalent about whether or not, to what extent, the public could be trusted with this information. There's questions of literacy, in some cases, actual literacy, media literacy, the ability to judge critically between different sources of information. To what extent would free speech just hyper-empower demagogues? After all, the Weimar Republic didn't really have a defense against the political organization of, and I apologize for reductio ad Hitlerum, but it wasn't just the National Socialist Party, but movements all across the world to this very day organized politically around lies and spread propaganda, which can have dreadful consequences for individuals. Does free speech on Twitter include using it as incitement for ethnic violence in Burma, in Myanmar, for instance, against the Rohingya? Granted, Facebook was the platform most implicated in that, but that's an issue. Right? Does freedom of speech extend to, is in our perfect free speech world, are groups, extremist groups organized around ethnic or religious or racial hatred, able to propagate lies and organize and mobilize out in the open because they are taking advantage of these protections? And the easy or the conventional response to that is, well, if you have a well-informed, educated, critically aware public, then you can count on individuals to do the parsing, to figure out for themselves that something like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a fabrication, that the narrative around American intervention in Iraq was a lie. There were no WMDs, that Saddam Hussein was not involved in September 11th, these kinds of things. And that depends on having a certain kind of public. And as the historical record indicates, in many cases, we haven't had that kind of bubble. There are many societies which have fallen precisely because you didn't have that mass critical engagement with information, the ability to figure out, for everybody to do their research and figure out what was a lie and what was the truth. Instead, lies could be extraordinarily consequential and propagated through the media space. So, focusing on the establishment of these agencies in Sweden, the United States, and elsewhere, without having sight of all of the other aspects that go into creating a free speech environment, for me, is very short-sighted and myopic. Those agencies by themselves are merely a tiny component. And if they are operating in conjunction with other elements of the environment, then it can be a very effective form of censorship and suppression, the propagation of false narratives. If they are running into oppositional forces scattered across the environment, then it could not even be that big a deal. Right? You end up with another toothless office somewhere that gets rolled up the next time there's a change of government. And when it comes to free speech in most countries, the speech environment in most countries, I think that these agencies they're very lagging. And if they matter, then a whole bunch of things have already gone so wrong that this is not going to be an effective fight. You can shut it down, but you won't actually get much closer to our desired end goal. And an excessive focus on those agencies will obscure other structural areas where, corruption or the suppression of free speech is at much greater. They can affect much more of that kind of censorship and repression. Let me give an example of how I would parse a given environment, and I'll pick something that's exotic enough so it shouldn't trigger anybody.
Okay.
Let's think about Tsarist Russia, right? Mm-hmm. What's the legal regime? The legal regime is Tsarist absolutism. There's no freedom of speech. The government, the Tsar, has the right to regulate and dictate what is expressed and what is not. The agencies that he suborns to enforce that are the judiciary, but also the aristocracy through which Russian feudalism operated, as well as the church, first and foremost. It was actually the Orthodox synods that had the greatest role in permitting or suppressing printed or, if you go back far enough, a written documentation. Books would get burned, and you needed prior permission to publish anything. In terms of what the policy environment was, well, it was fostering a unified Orthodox society, supporting nationalism, supporting Tsarist rule, hating the enemies of the state, suppressing information that was embarrassing. And the agencies that carried that out were things like the Okhrana, which was the late Tsarist secret police. There were divisions and offices that existed prior to that, but the Okhrana was the most notable one because of the way that it operated. For instance, it published, fabricated, and then disseminated the protocols of the Elders of Zion. That is the case of state-sponsored disinformation. So they also infiltrated journalists. They infiltrated newspapers, media organizations. They had agents in printing presses, in labor unions, and in the radical movement, including the Bolsheviks. So they were spying on everybody. They were pushing false narratives. They were doing their best to stymie the access to true information that did not serve a state function and push dangerous false narratives that got hundreds of thousands of people killed, directly or indirectly. Then there was the actual owners of newspapers and printing presses and individual printers. There were some extremely courageous journalists at the time, including the clandestine publishers of the Bolshevik journals and periodicals. They were trying their best, but in terms of the commercial press, it was disempowered. You didn't have to worry about Rupert Murdoch in Tsarist Russia because if the Tsar didn't approve of it, approve of a media baron, like they had no particular agency. And finally, you had a very illiterate, very superstitious public that didn't really know how to parse true information from fabrications. The protocols of the Elders of Zion. The most famous fan was, of course, Henry Ford, but there were hundreds of thousands, if not more, subjects in the Russian Empire accepted at face value. They could not distinguish truth from falsehood in that case. And that's what gave those kinds of official lies their power. They were also prone to accepting unofficial lies on the same basis. If you could somehow propagate a local conspiracy theory about, perfidious Westerners or Jews, of course, or other disfavored groups, or mobilize against things like smallpox vaccines, you could. The public didn't know how to interpret or handle the information that they were given. The level of education and respect for scientific knowledge, the respect for depth, the ability to tell what was well-sourced and what wasn't there for large parts of the population, so they were relatively easily manipulated. And so that's what my kind of analysis would look like applied to a given context. And if you wanted to get to the free speech promised land, you can see that it would take a lot of work across every front.
Okay, so a couple of points with some responses here. The first thing I would say is that when you bring in regulatory bodies like the FDA into the story, I think you are making a category mistake. The information is not the same as medicine. In order to create good medicine, you have to have open societies where information is shared, where there's transparency for science to operate.
No, you don't need societies. You need universities. You need segments within those societies. And one way that the Soviet Union, for instance,
you need societies that are transparent where information is free in order for these universities to be free enough to share information.
Mm-hmm.
And, there can be some limits to it, I guess, around, there we have journals that you have to subscribe to get the access to them, but the barrier should be incredibly low to get scientific information. So that's the first thing. To equate information with medicine, I think is misguided. That's a category mistake. It's not the same as processed beef either. We don't have ways to test information that are anywhere near as accurate as the ways that we test a medicine or beef. We're always needing to, especially when we categorize it so broadly as just information. So that's the first thing that I would object to, is that the idea that there should be a regulatory body for the press, I reject I know that there are instances where there are, for instance, the FCC with broadcast information, but you go ahead.
I just want to clarify one thing about what I said, because maybe I miscommunicated. I'm not proposing an FDA for information. I'm just saying that what I wanted to illustrate is that the government produces information, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the FDA approval is a form of information. And
right.
It would be impractical for us to get that information from a different source because of the technical and organizational requirements.
Right. But if we give the power to the government to suppress critics of their own methodology, for instance, then we are more likely to face errors that could lead to bad medicine being propagated than we are if we allow for criticism of the methodology employed by, let's say, government agencies tasked with testing the side effects of vaccine. The second thing I would say is that in the case of the Tsarist Russia, the what I don't know exactly how the public became dissident, organized, politically informed in order to try to create a revolution, but that did happen, and it happened despite efforts to control information rather than because of them. Education is a process of giving people more access and more critical abilities to understand information, not a practice of primarily of setting taboos and limits on the student. But this comes down to
Did I say that?
Education. No, but I'm just I'm not saying you did, but the in the United States, as recently as in the late 20th century, there was an understanding amongst the journalist set that their task was to be critics of the government as well as to rely on some information. Right? The public knew the corporate power, how corporate power, a good portion of the public knew how corporate power influenced the news. And there were countercultural.
Noam Chomsky, manufacturing dissent.
Yeah, right. That critique, I think, was adequate at the adequate manufacturing consent. I think that his propaganda model was a good critique of the media environment that existed in the late 20th century, and aspects of it are continuing to be relevant today. In fact, when it comes to critiquing someone like Rupert Murdoch or the people at MSNBC, even more so, the propaganda model is useful in order to understand how we can't rely on these sorts of news organizations to give us the whole truth or an accurate picture of the world. What I would say is, though, that the creation of these disinformation agencies seem to be part of an overall project to create a regulatory body to control information domestically, to circumvent limits placed upon the state by whether it's the Constitution or laws, and that what is most troubling for me is that of the left milieu, which I am a part of, doesn't seem to be particularly concerned about these limits, these new institutions, and the way in which what had been a relatively free terrain, despite inequities built into it, is now being closed off. It's now being, more tightly controlled. And in my pettiness, I just remember over the last 2 decades, and certainly the last decade, many people justifying campaigns of censorship that seem to be arising from private actors as not being campaigns of censorship because it didn't violate the state and wasn't violate the Constitution and wasn't coming from the state. And now that it is clear that many times, though there really were state actors involved, there's a lack of concern regardless. So that's what's troubling me. But I do think you're right that we need to educate the public, and we need to also kind of have I kind of think we have to start with a certain amount of faith in that the individual can exist, like that people have critical faculties that need to be encouraged. And that's the foundation that we need to start with our politics. And if we don't, we end up empowering agencies like the Psychological Defense Agency to protect us from the unwashed masses, and which we forget we're a part of. So that's my response. I don't think I did a very adequate job of meeting the intricacies of your statement, but that's what I've got.
Well, I'm not, just to put that one thing to bed, I'm not advocating an FDA for information. In fact, where I was going with that is that I think that the bigger issue that we're losing sight of is state capture, that all kinds of agencies that we rely on for whether it's something as specific as the safety of our medicines or food, or something as broad and systemic as protection of fundamental constitutional freedoms, have been corrupted and suborned by other interests. And the individuals that are staffing those agencies are pursuing enough of them in enough important positions, are not pursuing their constitutional duties. They're not fulfilling their obligations to the public. And therefore, that's where the order begins to fray.
I want to give you an example of that kind of thing happening that I find troubling. And is this kind of the example that you have in mind? The ACLU, which is not a governmental agency, but an activist nonprofit, it existed in order to defend the rights of individuals and protect the Bill of Rights, basically, and particularly the first.
It's in the name, right?
Right, American Civil Liberties Union.
Yeah, they defended the Klan.
They defended the Klan. They've defended many others. Not, it's not like they only defend the Klan.
Exactly.
That's it. And within the last few years, one of the leaders in the ACLU called for a book to be boycotted or banned. The book happened to be about transgender medicine and young girls, or something like that. I forget the name of the author and the book, but the point is that
it was a conservative book. It had an anti-trans take.
Right. It was a conservative
book. Or
book.
It was construed to be an anti-trans book.
Right. It was a conservative book, or it had, it took a position that the ACLU president or attorney or something didn't like. And so it was called, they called for it to be banned and taken off the shelves, which was remarkable to me that the ACLU, anyone in really, working with the ACLU would make such a call. Overall, that you could say, maybe I'm being naive here, but it seems to me that the Democratic Party itself has lost track of what used to be part of its character. At least its public facing character of trying to stand up for civil liberties and the rights of individuals and civil rights and so on. I don't know how that has entirely occurred, but it seems to me that one of the ways that we've lost control over and the kind of ideological sensibility of these institutions is due to states of exception that have arisen historically. So like, the attacks of September 11th created an excuse for these institutions to change. The economic crisis of 2008 likewise created the excuses for that. The election of Donald Trump was, kind of surprisingly, profoundly
Coronavirus, the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, all of it. And now I think with the war in Ukraine, that this is an opportunistic state of exception, that I don't believe that.
Oh, well, I think that all states of exception are opportunistic.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. But
there were,
I don't think, if it weren't for these other moments of states of exception, if it wasn't that we were already in a state of exception that's just being extended, I don't think that the public would stand for the amount of censorship around Ukraine.
Though, I recall immediately following September 11th, thanks to the free speech regime in the United States, I was reading arguments as to why the war on terror shouldn't be a war, and that the attackers should be pursued through international law and diplomacy. This treated as a strictly criminal case, which would mean not allowing it become a state of exception. So there was an alternative to the war on terror. It wasn't forced on them. And especially with the invasion of Iraq, we have the receipts. We know that was a war of choice, right? We have, I think it was Paul Wolfowitz saying, well, we settled on weapons of mass destruction because that was easy to sell to the U.S. public, but we were going in anyway. And so I think that I have no disagreement with what you just said.
Right.
I think you're absolutely correct. And I think that those states of exception, they accelerated existing erosion of elite commitment to the constitutional order. And with the result that more and more loopholes were introduced to allow for counter-constitutional abuses, whether Guantanamo Bay or the disinformation around the war and the justification for the war in Iraq, surveillance of Muslim Americans, all kinds of agent provocateur operations by the FBI to try to gin up conspiracies that would create and continue this feeling of crisis, as well as, for the individual officers, it wasn't that, hey, let's torpedo the constitutional order. It's like, hey, I need a big win in order to get my promotion. Mm-hmm. And I'm willing to do all kinds of shady, employ extra legal tactics in order to get there. And then when the arrest happens, the Justice Department, rather than living up to its constitutional duty and throwing out those cases, would instead side with the security apparatus. And similarly, I think the corruption of the judiciary. I mean, this week, you not only had the Harlan Crow connection with Clarence Thomas coming out, but Neil Gorsuch has received hundreds of thousands of dollars from the principal of a law firm, which is, I think, over 20 cases before the Supreme Court. Undisclosed sale of a major property that he had been sitting on at a high profit. This is corruption, and undermining the judiciary that's the one branch of government that is supposed to hold the executive in check. That's where you're supposed to have your constitutional liberties and the limitations on what the government can do still be enforced.
And as well hold the executive.
Oh yeah, but we've given up on that. But
okay,
right, like that's asking too much. But the fact that essentially, and the reason is that the Congress has the autonomy to set the rules, right? But enforcing rules, whatever they are, needs to be done transparently, needs to be done with integrity. Otherwise, no one believes in the rules. And that is where we're at right now. One reason why the public is so prone, is so liable for to accept disinformation, whether it's from, it's funny because the 2003 war in Iraq, WMD disinformation, was devastating precisely because of high levels of trust in government and institutions. So the agents that were occupying those institutions, when they lied, people believed them. Now, because of the record of official lies, of abusive and opportunistic exploitation of their control over the judiciary, right? That the fact that the rules do not apply equally to everyone, the fact that the rules can be twisted in favor of not just the government, but also all kinds of powerful interests, private and state, means that the public is highly susceptible to anti-systemic disinformation. They believe the things, they believe the criticism of the government, which is true, and they believe the criticism of the government, which is not true. They don't believe what the government tells them if it's false, but they also don't believe what the government tells them if it's true. Right. And this,
I just want to say about the invasion of Iraq. I don't remember the exact statistics, but that in fact was a fairly unpopular invasion and war, and we saw the largest protests in history before the invasion. And the other thing that was remarkable about that is that if you read just corporate newspapers, not radical left newspapers or radical right newspapers, if you read the newspaper record, the New York Times, which I did, along with the Financial Times in the lead up to that war, you would have known a number of things that were inconvenient for the administration. You would have known that, in fact, we had already been at war with Iraq for several years through the no-fly zones and were bombing the country every day. You would have known that there was no evidence at all of weapons of mass destruction, and that the UN had sent in weapon inspectors to verify that there have been multiple reports before these weapons inspectors were sent in saying that there was no evidence of it. And you would have known that that the reasons given for the invasion were changing all the time, that there wasn't even a consistent message about why they were going in, that you would have known that it was not as easy as it might have looked on the surface to even keep the UK in line to be part of a coalition to invade Iraq. And that, you would have known all of this just by reading the mainstream papers. And you did, reading them relatively critically maybe, but reading them.
Although you would have also known that, and we have the receipts, right? Judith Miller at the New York Times, precisely because it was an outlet that had this information which was inconvenient to the government. It was essential to push the disinformation, which was convenient to the government, through that outlet as well. You said that the war was very unpopular. That's only kind of true, because this era is also the beginning of the hyperpolarization of American politics. So you don't need a majority of Americans for a war. You need 50% plus one, maybe, probably less than that because most people don't vote. But and you get Fox News immediately because you're Republican, right? There, the government disinformation line is essentially all there is. That's what, 20, 25, 30% of the electorate. And it's enough to split the mainstream news audience. You don't need to get all of them. You don't need a unanimity of opinion in the New York Times. You just need a strong pro-war narrative to balance out all of the criticism, which is what they got. They got their war. George W. Bush was reelected, right?
But all of the information I gave you wasn't even presented in the Times as criticism, right? It was reported in it wasn't on the op-ed page. The op-ed page was by and large rah for the war. But if you just read the news, you could see what the story actually was. And also at the time, if you read The Guardian, it was really good as well. But my point is, you're right. There was a Fox News disinformation, campaign. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, was the Plame reporting on the potential nuclear armament of Iraq, about these aluminum tubes that they might.
It was the yellow cake uranium from Niger.
Yeah, right. So, and in that case, again, because you could, I read that, I believe, and then I also read criticisms of it and further reporting of it, and you could find what the sources were. And I knew that.
And you also have, Valerie Plame was outed as a CIA asset in the New York Times through Judith Miller, I believe, right?
Right.
So.
Right. And so there was an adversarial relationship between the Times and the state.
No, there was an adversarial relationship between the Times and the Times.
That's true, within the Times as well, right? Yeah, but also between the Times and the state. There was still this sense that the real job of a reporter was to find out facts and try to report them accurately.
I would honestly, if I could, and I'm docked to say this, but if I could get the 2003 vintage New York Times back up over here and and have that set the tone for the mainstream news, I take that offer in a heartbeat, because the situation has gotten much worse. Right. And I don't know if the decay in 2003 had gotten to a point where it could no longer be arrested, or if there was still the chance to sort of preserve the integrity of at least a significant segment of mainstream journalism. And
I want to be clear, I'm not nostalgic for that time. We went to war illegally, and the U.S. left had nothing to stop it, right?
Yeah.
Torture. Yeah, we had regimes of torture. We lost the right to habeas corpus. We had people getting detained without charges in America. We created a category called enemy combatants, where they didn't have any Geneva Convention rights or civil rights.
You had your secret Death Star prison in Guantanamo Bay, and
it was a nightmare world. I worried I was in some sort of quasi-fascist state at the time.
And it turns out that it was only the second circle of hell. There's many more to go.
Right. So, I'm not nostalgic for it, but my point is that this does seem to me, this moment where we are looking at the public announcements of agencies of disinformation that are aimed inward and outward, is a step beyond that. And especially, and I'm going to say something that a good portion of the audience won't like, and that I'm even a little reluctant to say, but especially considering how this emerged as a way to safeguard against a publicly elected president, because it was the election of Donald Trump that allowed for a new state of exception to emerge through the invention of the Russiagate story and the creation of a disinformation campaign around the Steele dossier, which, was not only used to delegitimate, to question the legitimacy of Trump, but also used as a way to question the legitimacy of any oppositional forces in politics that might start to emerge. They called Jill Stein a Russian agent. They called Bernie Sanders a Russian agent. They could label news stories that were inconvenient as Russian disinformation.
I mean, I think both of us at some point on Twitter, someone has accused us of being Russian assets.
Happens to me all the time. Yeah.
It's funny. I've got Russian asset, government plant, federal agents, enemy of the people.
Who called you the enemy of the people other than me recently? If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.